Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's program brought to you by the U.S. Botanic Garden. My name is Courtney Burris, the online education specialist with the Learning and Outreach team here at the Garden. We're so happy to have you joining us for the Wild and Weedy Plants We Need for the Future of Agriculture, an online lecture with Nan McCarry. Nan McCarry is an ethnobotanist focusing on the history of crop plants and their wild relatives. Nan earned her master's degree in geography from the University of Texas during her research on traditional home gardens in Ciudad Vieja, Guatemala. Currently, she is finishing a project on the conservation of the native grapes of North America. These are crop wild relatives of the wine grape. And if you don't know what crop wild relatives are, stay tuned. She's also coordinating a collaboration of researchers working on breeding perennial grain crops. She works at Watermark Woods Native Plants in Hamilton, Virginia, and she has been converting 3 acres into a native wood forest with many crop wild relatives, of course. Welcome, Nan.
Welcome. Thank you so much. So excited to be here. So excited to get to present with the U.S. Botanic Garden. And in a few places, I'll point out maybe some things that you can actually see at the garden if you happen to be lucky enough to be in the area to visit it. All right. So let's get started. Okay, I'm an ethnobotanist, and that is a person who studies the relationships between plants and people, or plants used by people. That could be medicinal plants, food and fiber, ornamentals, many other uses. And we all know that we depend on plants every single day for their ability to capture energy from the sun and get it into the rest of the ecosystem through insects and everybody else. So we're all totally dependent upon plants. And I don't know if everybody thinks about that all the time. My particular interest is food and agriculture. And so today this is a quick overview. We're going to talk about some crop failures, why that happens, where we could find the genetic diversity that is needed for crop improvement to avoid these sorts of failures. And then we'll finish up with some projects scientists are working on for a more sustainable agricultural system in the future. So we're going to start off with sort of the negative news, but I think anybody who gardens or farms is fully aware that crops are very vulnerable. This is my dad's cornfield last year when we had a terrible drought in Virginia. And of course, we all know that there are many fungal and insect pests and diseases that attack our crops. And we've even had some catastrophic crop failures in the past. In the top left, you see the Irish potato famine in the 1800s. I think many of us are familiar with that. I want to just point out two things that are going to be a theme here. So the Irish potato famine, of course, there was one clone planted over not just one farm, but many, many, many farms, vast acreage of one clone. And I think we know that that makes you vulnerable to any sort of little disease that comes along. And that's what happened. The late blight disease came along. So you need the genetic diversity in the plant, and you also need genetic diversity within the planting for a more polycultural system. We'll talk about that. Another notable crop failure that people may be familiar with is the phylloxera epidemic, which happened in the late 1800s. It almost completely wiped out the European vineyard industry and was a just terrible economic problem for Europe. And so we will talk a little bit more about the solution to that. And then more recently, in 1970, there was a southern corn leaf blight in vast acreages of corn in the Southeast United States. So this can continue to happen to us. And we are actually, many of our crops that we depend upon are threatened. And you may see articles from time to time about this. Banana is one of them. We're actually on our second banana called the Cavendish. And the former one was called the Gros Michel. It was attacked by a disease because, again, it was one clone planted over plantations worldwide. So when you get a disease in there, it just wipes out the whole thing. They had to go back to the drawing board, get a new banana, the Cavendish. Now that disease is in plantations in the Cavendish worldwide. So this is why, we hope scientists are out there working on our next banana because it's an important crop. Oh, and I just want to mention, as it happens, there's somebody at the U.S. Botanic Garden right now talking about the banana collection. I wish I could be there. I wish I could be in two places at once and hear what she has to say about the bananas at the garden. So where can we find the traits? And these are carried by genes. Now, traits are things like disease resistance or drought tolerance, and they're carried by genes. So we're really looking for genes. Where can we find these that we need to protect our crops now and with climate change and all the uncertainties coming at us in the future? Those are in crop wild relatives. So here we have one of the banana ancestors, some wild coffee, a chocolate relative. So just simply put, crop wild relatives are plant species occurring in the wild that are closely related to a crop species. I have wild in quotes here because we kind of know that nothing is truly wild. That is, nothing has been untouched by humankind. Our footprint is everywhere in the world now. So it's a bit of a relative term. We have black cherry up here, common tree, and we have Jerusalem artichoke down here on the right. And then over here, we have some grape leaves. One of these is labrusca, the one with the tan hairs underneath the leaf that you can see there. So Vitis labrusca is one of our crop wild relatives to a wine grape. It's also noted as one of the parents of the Concord grape, which of course gives us Concord grape juice and all sorts of other things. And you can find apparently this Concord grape, or I'm sorry, the labrusca grape in the kitchen garden at U.S. Botanic Garden. So these crop wild relatives hold the genes to help our crops withstand disease and other threats. And this is a fun little tomato that I grow in my garden. I get it from Southern Exposure Seed Exchange, and it's also growing in the kitchen garden. You can see it there. It's the wild ancestor of our tomatoes. So, and tomato is sort of interesting because this quote points out that the tomato cultivars that we plant in our garden or buy in the store have only 5% of the genetic variation that you find in the wild relatives. And this is a fellow that I was lucky enough to meet who is doing research on this very tomato and how the traits from that tomato can help our cultivated tomatoes withstand disease. So just to clarify, in case you were curious, crop wild relatives can be ancestors of our crops, or they can be other relatives. Teosinte is a great example. Many people who haven't heard anything about crop wild relatives have heard of Teosinte. So I always like to bring that up when I'm talking to people. It's also a fascinating story because, of course, as you can see, Teosinte doesn't really look anything like our modern corn or maize. And Courtney will put in the chat, I believe, a wonderful documentary you can watch about how Teosinte became domesticated and all the science it took from both archaeologists and geneticists to figure that out. So that's an ancestor of maize. Sometimes the ancestor is extinct and there is no ancestor around. But maize also has cousins, we call them. These are the crop wild. These are the relatives that are not the ancestor. Eastern gamagrass, which you can find in Virginia, is one of maize's relatives. This is a tripsicum grass, and I'm always really excited when I find it out in a pasture somewhere. So we may ask, why don't our crops naturally have the traits to resist and tolerate these threats, these things that we have to go back to the crop wild relatives for? That's a very complex question. I'm just going to very briefly touch on two of the reasons that this is the case. One of them has to do with what we call a bottleneck. So starting 10,000 years ago, the very selection process itself, you can see, let's say these are genes here inside the bottle. You can see even as we started with the early domesticates, and by the way, there's so much to say about plant domestication. I'm not going to go into that more. And there's a lot of links if you want to learn more about plant domestication. But that just means the evolutionary process that plants went through as they adapted to humankind and became our crops. But that very selection process itself caused a bottleneck, because when you think about it, we're probably selecting for yield or for ease of harvest or for taste. We're not, when you're out in the woods or wild places selecting, you're not selecting for every single gene and trait that the plant has. So this is not the case with all of our crops. It's very much the case with some of our annuals and things like that. Actually, it's not the case with grapes. There isn't the bottleneck that you see in some of these other crops. And another reason our crops don't have these traits that you find in the wild is that the wild plants are continuing to evolve out there in nature under all the threats that come at them, all the diseases and pests and cold and drought and salinity. So they have to adapt or survive. So what we see out there in the wild are the things that are surviving and passing on their genes, whereas what we have in our farms and gardens are the things we're protecting from those very threats. So you may be wondering, many people are interested in heirlooms. I think it's something most gardeners and people who go to farmers markets are very aware of heirlooms these days. Heirlooms are also super important. I just want to make a distinction here that heirlooms, which are a cultivated variety or a cultivar, they are part of the crop. So within this crop, we have all sorts of cultivars, and including heirlooms. Out here, we have the crop wild relatives. This is all one species on the left. This is the crop species and many variations on that species. Out here, we have the wild relatives. That could be different species or even sometimes in a different genus. Let's see. Oh, that's right. I mentioned teosinte and how it's in that garden. Okay. A little bit more about the, oh, and Courtney, you know what? I was supposed to stop. Let's stop and get some questions, because I just want to make sure that everybody's clear with what a crop wild relative is, or if there's any basic questions that people have.
It looks like, Nan, we are all simply enthralled in what we are learning. So there haven't been any questions yet in the chat, but we can certainly keep going. What we're noticing, though, is that we're seeing folks from East Coast, West Coast, and everywhere in between. So you're really ringing some bells across the lands that we see and that we're working with. So we're really excited to hear more.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. And you know what? I'm so excited about all of this. I'm probably talking fast because I have so many slides I want to tell you guys about. So,
well, yes, well, teach us, Nan, and then
okay.
As we have questions, we'll collect them, and then we can ask at the end.
Okay, sounds good. Okay. Okay, so we were just talking about heirlooms as a kind of cultivar or cultivated variety. There's a kind of heirloom that we call landrace, and that is an heirloom that's tied to a particular farming community or even a family or a region. So it's a cultivar that has adapted to a certain region under certain agricultural traditions and is maintained by those people. So land races are super important as a source of genetic diversity. And so I just want to briefly talk about those. I was fortunate to be able to go along on this research trip where bilingual folks in Quechua and Spanish interviewed the traditional farmers in the Andes. And the reason we were there is that the potato was domesticated in the Andes. Very important that everybody knows that, and that it wasn't domesticated in Ireland, and that there are thousands of these cultivated varieties or land races in the Andes. You see just a snapshot of them here with their names, mostly in Quechua, and you can see all the amazing colors and shapes. And of course, these are adapted to different situations. There's even one that's adapted to a freeze-dried sort of farming that they do, or processing that they do. So that's something more about land races, but we are going to return to crop wild relatives, which is the main topic here. And remember, these are the cousins. Okay. This is just a few that I happen to put up here. Some of them I'm growing in my yard. The pink fuzzy bean, wild yam, and this sunflower relative I bought at the Native Plant Nursery, Watermark Woods, where I work. I just have a lot of fun bringing crop wild relatives into my garden. I don't know that I'm conserving lots of genetic diversity, but maybe one day, right? Okay, wild plum is another one that the plum genus Prunus is huge. A lot of our cherries, plums, almonds, apricots, peaches are Prunus. And so conserving these relatives in the Prunus genus is very important. So this is one of the wild plums, and here's a relative of tomatillo. By the way, this pink fuzzy bean has been looked at for salinity tolerance. So it's in a different genus than the cultivated bean, but so that means it's going to be a little harder to cross, but it is being looked at for salinity tolerance, which is going to be of increasing importance with climate change. And we have delicious crop wild relatives that I'm growing in my yard. So this is the American hazelnut, a little bit smaller than the European hazelnut, but a crop wild relative that has a trait of resistance to a disease that plagues the domesticated European hazelnut. Virginia strawberry, really great ground cover. Couldn't recommend this enough. Pretty little flower, delicious little tiny fruits. They're tiny, you got to search for them, but they're a lot of fun to find. And this is actually one of the parents. It was crossed with the Chilean strawberry to make the modern strawberry that we now find in the grocery stores. Persimmons, we're going to talk about a little bit more. Purple flowering raspberry I put up because it's beautiful. However, it also has little berries that you can eat. Persimmon is really interesting because it just illustrates something that I think we all need to think about a little bit more, about how so many things in nature are on a spectrum. They're not really all this or all that. Not all things are not either completely wild or completely domesticated. Many plants have come under human tending throughout history. We see this with indigenous groups that have tended things in the United States and in what is now the United States, but you see it all over in every continent in the world, that there are things along the spectrum to domestication, because all domestication is a process, an evolutionary process of humans selecting what plants they want to bring home to their gardens or their yards, or throw in the dump heap and then they sprout up into something. It's a process that's not always planned out, not a decision as much as, hey, I like these berries, I'm going to take them home. So there's a lot of things that are in this spectrum. Jerusalem artichoke is one of them. It was never fully domesticated, but as we know, you can find Jerusalem artichoke tubers. And then there's work on persimmon there's an ethnobotanist named Nancy Ross who's looking for she's looking for the genetic sort of imprint of a signature, we would call it, of how these persimmons were casually tended by the American Indians over the centuries. And this is the kind of thing that does show up in genetic signatures. So we can talk more about that if you have questions. So did you know that crop wild relatives saved a whole industry? I think, so I mentioned the phylloxera epidemic in like one of the early slides. And this might look complicated to you. Just take it. If you don't know about grafting, don't worry about it. This is the graft. This is the rootstock. We're going to talk about the rootstock right here. So this phylloxera epidemic attacked the roots of the European vineyards. And so eventually a solution was found, which was to take these 3 North American grapes and use them as rootstock and breed them together as rootstock. And they are resistant to phylloxera because they evolved with phylloxera. So that's what we're often looking for. What has evolved along with that pest, and so therefore has some natural resistance to it. To this day, a glass of wine you drink almost anywhere in the world is grafted onto rootstock that is composed at least somewhat of these 3 species. They're crucially important for our rootstock worldwide, for the grapevine industry worldwide. And this one over here, Vitis rupestris, is notable because it's vulnerable now. Its range has greatly decreased over time. And so it's the kind of thing, you know, it could die out. And so it's really important. Like, we like to conserve plants because biodiversity is good in its own, for its own sake. But this is also important to humankind to have this grape. Let's see if there's anything else I wanted to say about those. Oh, yeah. I was fortunate to work on a project that was partnered, that the U.S. Botanic Garden partnered with on a workshop on the North American grape several years ago, and brought together lots of specialists looking at these questions and looking at the North American grapes as both crop wild relatives worthy of conservation for both agriculture and just as wild plants.
So then, yes, we do have a couple of questions that I think will help to kind of set some foundational things. So one, we were talking about the potato, right? And we wanted to know, is there just one species in like many cultivars? Like how does that work?
Excellent question. Thank you so much. Yeah. Some of these things, like maize, it's one species. Potato, I'm really interested, this person asked this question because there's actually several species that are domesticates. There's one principal one, like all the potatoes we're going to buy in the grocery store here are Solanum tuberosum. But in the Andes, there's a few other species as well. I just didn't go into that because it makes it more complicated. But yes, there are several species. I forget if there's like 5 or 7 or something like that. And then within that, there are thousands of these land races or cultivars.
So speaking of wild relatives, we wanted to know the difference between a crop wild relative and a native plant. Is there an overlap?
There's definitely an overlap, and that's one of the things I have a lot of fun with. Like, it doesn't really matter where your crop wild relative came from, but I think it's really fun to, because I'm also interested in native plants, to kind of highlight the ones that we could find locally, either even in native plant nurseries or growing in the wild in parts of the United States. So yeah, it's a Venn diagram kind of thing. So some of your crop wild relatives are also going to be native plants. You know, you can have a crop wild relative that's an invasive. Like, things don't fall in nice categories.
Yeah. And I think that kind of leads us to one other question about even how to find the seeds to it. So normally, you know, you can find seeds when things do fall in a nice category, you know, exactly the plant shop to go to, you know, because it falls nicely. But in this case, where can the home gardener get like these heirloom seeds and wild ancestors? Like, where's a good place for them to start?
So I have several links. There's something called the Experimental Farm Network that I have on that paper that I think you're going to share. He does, that group does a ton with all sorts of things that are semi-domesticated, domesticated. They're always experimenting. You know, Southern Exposure Seed Exchange, whom you've had on before. I think you had Ira Wallace talking about collards. There are groups like that, and Utopian Seed Project that where it's nice because you might be buying seeds or plants from them, and then you're also supporting their work, and they're trying to do this work going forward.
It says they're especially interested where you recommend getting wild ancestors because collecting them from the wild is often banned.
Absolutely. Yeah. I don't suggest that you go out and collect rare plants at all.
Okay.
At all. Yeah. You know, you don't want to collect ramps, right? You want to find another source for ramps because they're declining in the wild. And that's where, if you're really interested, you could go to NatureServe and they rank these plants and they tell you which ones are the G1s through G3. You don't want to be collecting those plants. In general, we don't really advise collecting plants. There's so many sources to get these seeds and plants from. that have been collected over time that you usually don't have to go out in the wild and
Yeah.
collect them.
That's okay. That's excellent information to have because sometimes, just the connotation of wild might mean, free and open and you can kind of just grab them.
Yeah.
But yeah, there are responsible ways of
Yes.
collecting these plants and these seeds and really getting involved in this side of agriculture. So,
Right.
okay, perfect. And, and then thank you that scientists are, we do have some folks that are excited that scientists are able to save our wine grapes as they also put up a cheers with a glass of wine.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. Super important. Yeah. We'll talk a little bit more about that going forward too.
great. All right. Thanks for the Q&A, Nan. Please teach us more.
Okay.
All right.
Okay. So, kind of leading right into this. This is great. Some crop wild relatives are threatened, like all plants, right? We know there's a biodiversity crisis in general, and crop wild relatives to me are just one more reason to conserve biodiversity. But they are threatened particularly by grazing and deer browse. Actually, that's one of the threats to that Vitis rupestris that's important for rootstock. And that's not recent. That's like over 100 years it's being grazed. Invasive plants are a huge threat to biodiversity. And there are many things people could say about invasive plants. It's not that things are inherently good or bad. When a plant is invasive, it's threatening the natural ecosystems, and that's not good. Habitat loss, always a problem for loss of biodiversity. And then with crop wild relatives, we have a specific threat that is that they can have hybridization with the cultivated plant. So this is on the lower right hand corner is Vitis californica. It's the California grape. I'm told there's one growing at the U.S. Botanic Garden in the Mediterranean room, I think. And anyway, so it's a grape it's a wild grape that grows in California, and it has been what we call genetically swamped by the cultivated wine grape, Vitis vinifera. And that's because plants really hybridize easily. Certain groups of plants like grapes hybridize very widely. So this is going to happen in the wild. And then for various reasons, the genes of the domesticated wine grape have sort of swamped the genes of Vitis californica, so that it's considered that there is no more pure wild California grape out there. And, that's something we might need some genes from at some point, and we don't have it as much. I'm going to talk about a few more places, a few more crops in the future or wild relatives that have had that genetic swamping. So how do we go about conserving crop wild relatives? So there's in situ and ex situ conservation. In situ conservation just means conserved in the place they grow naturally, where they evolved. That's the ideal. We want them out there evolving in their natural habitats with all the threats that the climate and everything throws at them. In the United States, we have two specific places where we have reserves for crop wild relatives. It would be great if we had a lot more of these crop wild relatives. But there's one called the Wild Chili Botanical Area, and this is the chiltepine, or the wild chili, the ancestor of the chili. You also can see this in the kitchen garden at the Botanic Garden. Gary Nabhan and others were the ones who made this happen, so that there is this wild chili botanical area. There's also one for cranberries that is closer to home here where I am. It's in West Virginia. So most of them are just out there evolving in the wild, and we hope on protected land, or that private landowners are conserving them. Then there's ex situ conservation. You can think of this as the insurance policy or the backup. Super important, because if something is wiped out in the wild, we like to know that it is conserved. So I put this picture up of Svalbard because I think many people are familiar with it. It's sort of the It's the backup system for the whole world of our plant genetic resources, and it's in Norway, and that's a really important thing. So there are these things worldwide. In the United States, we have the National Plant Germplasm System, and these are all agricultural research centers in different places where they specialize in certain crops and the cultivars and the wild relatives related to those crops. There is some concern with things going on that about keeping this system going. I think this is a system we should be very proud of. And this is what breeders rely on. This is where breeders go to get the seeds that they need to breed crops that are resistant to all sorts of things. And so we don't want this system to, we want to make sure this system stays around. And so I think there's a news article that I posted that Courtney can post about that. So in situ, ex situ conservation, both are very important. So let's finish up with a positive note, which are some things scientists are working on to bring us more sustainable agricultural systems in the future. And then just for fun over here, I have what you can do to support this. Okay, so back to our grapes. This is Surya Sapkata. He is in Kearneysville, West Virginia at one of these agricultural research centers with the USDA. And he's breeding new wine grape hybrids adapted to the mid-Atlantic. So this is really important because in the mid-Atlantic, the European wine grape really isn't adapted to grow here well. So you have to spray it a lot. And, you know, we don't really want to be doing that if we don't have to. So Surya is breeding grapes that will have some natural resistance to all of the mildews and other pathogens that come after our grapes. And some of these are found in some of these wild grapes like the Vitis estivalis and others. And there's a long history. I have whole presentations just about the grape because there's a long history of natural hybridization out in nature that led us to some of our early cultivars and hybrids. And now we have, of course, research over more recent times of expressly trying to breed these hybrids that can adapt to cold or can withstand these pests and mildews. And what you can do is when you're drinking wine anywhere in the world, look for wine made from hybrid grapes. I mean, if you're in Europe, that's great. Use the European wine grape. But if you're in other parts of the world, you might want to look for what's been hybridized with my native grapes. And presumably that's been done so that there's a little resistance in there to some of the worst pathogens that are found in my area. So these are some of my favorite wines from Virginia. Okay, and then there's scientists working on breeding more nutritional potatoes, and they're using these land races that we talked about. I don't want to go into this too deeply, but this is called metabolomics. And this is looking at these cultivars for their whole nutritional quality, including not only the big things that we might think of, but the more minor nutrients that are so important and very important for gut health. And I'm just beginning to get into working on this a little bit, but the scientist that I talked to in Colorado, actually, after coming away from talking to her, I said, I'm going to eat more purple potatoes because they're healthy for you. So she and other teams are looking at how to get some of those nutrients into our potatoes that are more available on the shelves. Okay, then there's research on really the traditional way that probably most of our ancestors grew their crops in the past, which is in mixtures, and they are called maslins in certain cultures. And so there's a lot of research from New York Botanic Garden and others looking at these growing in, mixing the different crops together. And so that you're harvesting them all together. And when you think about it, if you garden, what you notice is we have good years and bad years for different crops, right? So you really want little insurance policies. You don't want to just put all your eggs in one basket like we do with our monocultures. hoping that like, okay, I hope it's a good year for corn, but maybe it's not. Like this year is a good year for cucumbers for me for some reason, but the tomatoes aren't doing as well. I think that polycultures are the way forward, and this Maslins is the research they're doing on it is one way of dipping into that. So the action item for you is look for foods grown in more polycultural systems. So then there's effort, actually something else that the U.S. Botanic Garden is partnering with is an effort by Botanic Gardens Conservation International U.S. of preserving those relatives of the fruit and nut species. Remember I talked about the Prunus genus, and so there's a lot of those relatives across North America. We're looking at where they're conserved, not only in wild areas, but also in botanic gardens who have sometimes had these plants around for a long time. And anywhere we can conserve this genetic diversity, we want to do that. So this is a local project that Ty Ralston is doing at Blandy Arboretum on the butternut. The butternut is another crop wild relative that is being swamped genetically by the Japanese walnut. So it's a relative of the cultivated walnut, the domesticated walnut, which of course we all enjoy eating. So it's important for that. And it also has a disease. So he found butternuts on different people's properties. He had them genotyped to figure out which ones were pure butternut genetics and not hybridized. And now he's planted those out. They're planting a lot of them at Blandy. My friend and I picked up a whole bunch to plant in home gardens and in other places, and to see which ones don't succumb to the butternut canker disease. Okay, and then the Land Institute, which people may have heard of, is breeding perennial grains to replace annual grains. So when domestication happened, for various reasons that are still being researched, we domesticated a lot of annuals. Wheat, for example, is an annual. Corn's an annual. We want to go towards perennials. And anybody who's been in the native plant movement has seen slides or pictures like this, showing how here's your lawn grass, short little roots. Here's your native grasses. You want to get long roots down into the soil. We want to do the same thing with agriculture. So we have annuals. This is the system we're in. But they are now breeding perennials, and they're showing you here in this beautiful drawing how over time, what do you get? You get roots down in the soil. You're controlling erosion. You're reaching different, more access to water in different levels of the soil. There are so many reasons that perenniality is the way to go for a more sustainable future. I think it's probably the most important thing. And the Land Institute came up with Kernza, and that is a perennial wheat that's a cross between wheat and something else. And you can buy Kernza beer. You can buy all sorts of things. If you look hard enough in certain portions of the United States, you can find this Kernza flour. And I even got to eat some Kernza cookies. And they're now looking at silphium, which native plant people might know of, this rosin weed. And so that's, they're looking at that to replace the annual crops that give us our oil seeds. This would be a drought resistant crop that's in the domestication pipeline to bring us a more perennial source of oil seeds. So please save the crop wild relatives for the sake of bananas, coffee, and wine. Thank you very much. I'd love to get any of your questions.
Wow, wow, wow. Thank you so much. Thank you, Nan. Yes, we have questions. We have excitement, especially about bananas. And all of those wonderful things. So let's make us be able to see you a little bit better. There we go.
Okay.
So we do have a question. Can you tell us why those crops were harvested annually instead of perennially over time?
You mean why we domesticated annuals instead of perennials?
It seems like that's, yep, I think that's where she was headed. Yep.
I'm very interested in this question. And I actually reached out to experts over 6 months ago and said, is it just the larger seeds that you get with the annuals? And this is actually something they're still looking at. They're
Okay.
still trying to figure out why. There's a lot of theories about why we happen to domesticate annuals, but I don't know that the final really research is in on that.
Okay.
Now, don't forget, we got lots of vines and trees. We have a lot of perennials. We just don't have perennials that are our major crops that are providing the carbohydrates for the world, like wheat and corn.
Got it. Okay. And so we're also looking at questions about, are crop wild relatives often considered weeds
Yeah,
because they
absolutely.
thrive in the same
Absolutely. I have
environment?
whole
Yeah.
slides on that I didn't put in here, but yeah,
Yeah.
a lot of times, like a crop wild relative could be a very unexciting roadside weed that you drive right past.
Huh.
That's sometimes where that genetic diversity is held because, maybe it's adapted to disturbed habitats, which there's a whole thing with our crops kind of came out of disturbed habitats. So a lot of those things like those disturbed habitats, and that's really what we call a weed, is something that's adapted to disturbed habitats.
Gotcha. Yeah. That's, it's so amazing that after these talks, right, we're driving along the road and suddenly all of the plants and the trees that we see going along the road have like a new meaning for us. Like, huh, I
Yay!
wonder, I wonder how far back this plant goes and what it can actually be used for. And then that brings us to a question: the Kernza, is it available commercially? Is
It is
Kernza
available
available?
commercially.
Uh-huh.
I don't know if you can find it in the Washington area easily or not. I know
Yeah.
it's definitely in certain markets. The Land Institute that developed it is in Salina, Kansas. And I think in Colorado and Kansas and various markets, and probably like I think I've heard in Minnesota and so forth. I think if you start looking and start demanding Kernza, what we want to do is create demand for perennial agriculture.
Okay. Creating demand for perennial agriculture. I'm actually going to write that down because that is also another springboard, right, into finding out other ways to live, finding out other ways to eat, finding out, what are the smaller ways that we can contribute to this larger issue
Right.
that we see, right? Because sometimes it feels paralyzing. Like,
It
oh my
does.
gosh, there's so much going on, but you've given us so many hopeful notes and so many good cues. A question that we have here is, do you have recommendations about how we can identify native plants and crop wild relatives in our own gardens? Could there be some natural places around that we might identify some things?
Well, I mean, I just use Seek every time like everybody else probably out there. If I see a plant I don't recognize, I use Seek or one of the other apps. And then if I find out it's something, if it is in the same genus as something
Yeah.
I know to be a crop,
Yeah.
then I really start researching it. But I there's no short of those little places that I put on there for the cranberry and the chiltepine,
Mm-hmm.
and a few demo places at Botanic Gardens. There's not that many places to find crop wild relatives that you're going to know if you're not already a botanist who kind of knows what they're looking for.
Got it. Yeah, yeah. And this is why we have these talks, right? And this is why we're connected to organizations and to people, that we can get curious and we can ask those questions when we're connected to folks that are doing it with us locally. Again, you've provided some links in to connect with these organizations that are like really in it.
Mm-hmm.
We do have some other questions about crop wild relatives, and if they can easily breed with crops, or is it a laboratory challenge to get them
Both.
to combine? Okay.
Both. So it really varies. And for example, with the grapes, as I mentioned, like the grapes love to hybridize with each other. So
Okay.
some of the grapes are very easy to interbreed. It kind of depends. Usually, the closer you are in evolutionary history, the more easy it's going to be to make that cross. I do want to say that plants hybridize much more than animals. We hear about animals creating things like the mule that therefore is a dead end genetically. That doesn't happen with plants as much. That's a long story in itself, but plants do hybridize. Some of these things, are not easily hybridized, and somebody in a lab is going to have to sort of figure out. I've even heard that there is what do they call it? Sometimes they'll hybridize this thing with that thing and take that and hybridize it over with this other thing, because that's the way to get bridge the genes over to the crop where they want. But the breeders do amazing things that I know very little about.
Okay. With that, speaking of like the folks that are behind the scenes of the things, right? How does it work for scientists like to identify these traits in crop wild relatives that are helpful in changing climate, like drought tolerance, salinity tolerance, in the breed crops that have these traits? Like, does that take a long time? Is that like a totally different lane? Like,
no, it's part of the whole picture. I mean, breeding for climate change is huge. Like, that's probably our biggest like challenge, right? Or one of our biggest challenges. Luckily, scientists have been thinking about this for a while.
Yes.
So, they kind of saw this coming and have been documenting. That's why the scientists on the ground doing some little research on that little pink fuzzy bean that I showed, that they find on a beach somewhere, they might say, hey, this is got salinity tolerance. This is where keeping that data, this is where scientists on the ground doing that work and then getting that data into places where other scientists can access it is important. So they've been looking at it for a long time. And then, this is where Gary Nabhan's work and a lot of other people in the Southwest come in. They've been thinking about climate change for a long time, and they're in the arid Southwest. So they're aware of what crops do, what wild plants do well there, and what cultivars do well there.
I'm loving this because you're an ethnobotanist, right? Like, this idea of humans interacting with plants this is a beautiful place for that, because you think of one crop, right? But you don't think of, not all the time, maybe might just be me, y'all. You don't think of the different folks that are involved in this, right? So we're hearing about the farmer, right? We're hearing about the person that's in it, right? The gardener. You're hearing about the scientist, right? And we can also, if you don't mind, just touching on the indigenous folks that have been doing it, right? These more traditional agricultural systems, because they are very much a part of this work as well.
So that's where, if you remember, I had the thing about the spectrum. That's where a lot of the American Indians did domesticate a few crops. But there's a lot of other crops that they casually tended. Maybe it means they, made some irrigation go towards the crop. Maybe they weeded around it. Maybe they selected seeds. They didn't bring it to a full domestication, but that doesn't matter. There's a story, there's a book called Tending the Wild by Kat Anderson. And she recounts how when the Europeans first got to California, they said, look at all these wild plants, but they weren't all wild plants. Many of them were semi-domesticated or incipient domesticates. They had been tended by the Native Americans for centuries or millennia. And therefore that changes the genetics. Everything you do changes the genetics for the next generation. So and there is an effort with the groups that I'm working with to say, how can we recognize what groups have used this in the past or even casually tended it in the past. The Land Institute also, I'm talking with somebody at the Land Institute about this very question. We have to sort of figure this out. They're looking at silphium, as I said, and these other things. And her job, her name is Aubrey Streit Krug. Her job is to look at this. How do we recognize the contributions of these indigenous groups? And this is, her training is in that area. So if you want to Google the Land Institute and look for the stuff on silphium and the stuff and Aubrey Streit Krug,
Hmm.
You can find, I think that would be another good entry point.
Love that. Love that. Because
We call them,
education
sorry,
and learning. Yeah, please, please.
we also we had a symposium last year. Many people from the U.S. Botanic Garden were there. We called it Crop Wild Relatives and Wild Utilized Plants, and that's what we call the plants that are casually used or used at all, used by various indigenous groups. We call them wild utilized plants because they're not domesticated, but that doesn't mean they don't have tons of value for certain groups.
Hmm.
That's another Venn diagram. So sometimes you get the crop wild relatives and the well utilized plant. It can be both, or
Yes.
sometimes it's in one or the other.
Yes. Yes. So it sounds like one of the ways we can do this is by, just committing ourselves to learning more, right? So whether that's connecting with the local resources that we have, whether it's looking at this recording again, whether it's coming to the USBG and looking at our kitchen garden. Um, you also brought up the hybridized grapes and maybe choosing wines that have the hybridized grapes. Can
Yes.
you talk a little bit more about that?
So that is something you can even ask when you're at a vineyard. And I
Okay.
started working on this with this partnership with the U.S. Botanic Garden. I started working on this like in 2017 or 18, and everybody kind of looked at you cross-eyed because they were like, "We don't want to talk about that." But that's
Yeah.
changed a lot. And in
Yeah.
Virginia now, it's changed so much that now they have this new guy working on it in Corneliusville, West Virginia. So I think there is a real interest in hybrid grapes, and I think
Hmm.
you can start asking for them. And people, your particular wine grower might not know about it yet, but there's an opportunity to say, now that's a tough thing for them. It's not like wheat where you can go and plant a new variety next year. They're stuck.
Okay.
They have the vines they have and they last for 20 years or something. But
Yeah.
it would be good to know that there's consumer demand for these vines that
Yeah.
are these wines made from hybrid grapes. And one of the things I put on the list is called the Organic Wine Podcast. It's now the Beyond. I told him it's Beyond Organic, so it's now the
Yeah.
Beyond Organic Wine Podcast. But I did an interview with him, and if you look at his stuff, he has a lot of interesting things, talking to people all over the world about this movement away from a dependence on vinifera, which
Hmm.
doesn't always do that well in certain climates.
Gotcha. And with that, doing well in climates, knowing what does well, can we close with what perennial crops can home gardeners grow? We just want to get our hands dirty, get on
Um,
into the movement. What might we be able to do?
well, I got some currency seeds, but I don't know that they're readily available yet. I would go to Experimental Farm Network, which is on that list.
Yes.
I believe they're out of New Jersey.
Okay.
And there's if you start following this stuff on Instagram, I started following them, and all of a sudden you find out all the other little niches where they're
Yeah.
working on this stuff and where you can either buy things or support what they're doing. So I would go to Experimental Farm Network to start looking
Yeah.
for that.
Yeah. This has been quite a journey, and it's so much for us to begin to learn. It's so much to apply what we've already learned, and it's going to take more of these conversations. It's going to take just kind of dropping in those little words like hybridized grapes, those little words like perennial crops. Those terms that get us moving and thinking in the right direction when it comes to
Mhm.
diversifying our crops and how important it is across the nation, from East Coast, Mid Atlantic to West Coast. It's important stuff because we want to still be here. We want to have food. We want to, and we want to have it for our kiddos and grandkiddos.